I have to say, I don't think I've ever stared at one fixed point for quite so many hours before. Slightly hypnotic at times.
Yes.
And being looked at by you, normally if somebody's looking at you, respond and look back at them, and I'm trying to resist the urge to watch you.
Even from the looking side of it, the optics that we're using, the science of the optics. I'm not even recognizing when you're sitting there that I'm actually looking at you, even though you just pointed out that I'm looking at you, which is quite interesting. We discussed earlier the way I was working in sort of planes and shifts of tone to create a three-dimensional object on a two-dimensional surface.
I think in some ways as scientists, my work was structure of DNA.
Yeah, which is fascinating because it's the three-dimensional.
Absolutely, but it's that same sort of thing. We're trying to understand what it means by reducing it, reductionist science. But if you discard everything, if you've just done a very flat image, you lose the movement, the humanity.
Yes.
Those three-dimensional shapes and your focus on them is a bit like scientists trying to actually capture the realities, not just almost a sort of cartoon image of what's happening.
When I think of DNA, the layman like me would see it as a double helix.
And most scientists, most bioscientists, biologists will think of it just as a double helix. It has other shapes, so the two strands can unwind and do other things.
Right.
They can turn into knots, they can fold up in all sorts of ways, and these are often on-off switches, effectively, that turn particularly cancer-related genes on and off. The double helix is the sort of basic thing, but when it's actually doing anything, it's a bit like if you look at books. Books in a library are always closed.
Yeah, it's a good analogy, actually.
But that's not when a book is interesting. So if you just studied them the wrong way, you'll get the wrong image.
Right, interesting.
One thing I found really fascinating was just looking at the sort of the range of colours, because in some sense, it looks much richer. There's colours in there that I wouldn't necessarily have thought. I mean, they're there.
Yeah.
When you paint it, it's right. But if I'd been asked to describe the colour of various things, I wouldn't have seen all of it.
I don't really think of it as colour, per se. I consider it tone or value. So when I'm looking at a forehead, I'll say, okay, well, I'm going to mix this with a burnt umber, a blue, and maybe a little bit of white. And then I'll have to put it or juxtapose it against another plane. And that's how the painting evolves. We also touched on a bit of perspective. The way perspective works in, portraiture in a way. Your nose is in a certain place, and I have to paint your ear somewhere else, which is literally three-dimensional in perspective. But also how compositional work, it's somewhat scientific. We discussed that in the Renaissance, pre that, there wasn't really any perspective.
This is one of the things that I find so weird. If you go back to when they were drawing things that were utterly flat, did they know it was wrong? Somehow they must have resolved this internally.
Well, I guess that's when the artist becomes scientist, or the scientist becomes the artist.
There is huge overlap in terms of, anatomy. Is that art or science? Well,
there are medical illustrators. Well, is an illustrator an artist, or is he a medical person?
For a medical illustrator, it's perhaps important that they get some things precisely.
Absolutely.
Precisely right, Whereas to some extent you're trying to capture something that's not just the precise angle the hair is, because there's what does a photo just reveal is the the precise number of hairs somebody has in their eyebrows, which you're not interested in particularly. No. And there's a place for that, absolutely, but it's not the same thing.
Yeah.
There is something about building up from minimal information. I'm just thinking back to the first time I got to see this. The sort of science I tended to do was very much, I don't know what's out there. So can I have a quick glance and say, oh look, there's some things over here. That might be interesting.
That's the discovery,
isn't it? And in some ways, there's maybe something between that discovery phase and your first phase of it's a bit like this. I know it's not quite right. It's not quite the colours. It's definitely not the right shapes. But you start off with that thing, and then you can build something that's much deeper, which to me is how science develops.
The difference, I think, from our art or creating something, like we said, three-dimensional on a two-dimensional surface, is that I'm editing as I go along. You're discovering.
But often the discovery is that what I thought previously wasn't quite right. So there's sometimes this view that in science you just have, here is the absolute truth. And in the same way that you don't get a sort of a painting which is just, here it is, there's nothing more ever could be done, you don't really get that with science either.